Welcome to everybody. We're glad to have you with us today. My name is David Campbell. I'm one of the co-chairs of the ACT Knowledge Mobilization Committee, who we will introduce the rest of the committee to you shortly. But we're glad to have you with us here for our very first KM webinar, first of a series that we'll be having over the next year or so. Yeah, we're hoping to just launch our committee today and tell you a few things. So next slide, Selina. Then we'll kind of go through the order of events for today's webinar. Today, we're hoping to introduce you to our committee and kind of go through some of the activities that we have planned for the remainder of the ACT Consortium's funding period, and to tell you about an exciting funding opportunity, the Knowledge Mobilization Award that we are launching with today's webinar. We'll then have the chance to do a little bit of an introductory session to what knowledge mobilization is and how we can incorporate it into clinical trials specifically, and hopefully get you all who are attending today thinking about innovative ways to do knowledge mobilization and ways to share the results of your clinical trials and other controlled trials. And then we have some time for a Q&A at the end, and we will preview the next knowledge mobilization webinar, which we'll be doing next month. So that's what to look forward to through the remainder of the hour here. So we'll just start with who we are as the Knowledge Mobilization Committee. We'll want to tell you a little bit about what our role is and why we are part of the ACT ecosystem. And what activities we have planned. So this is the who we are piece. So the Knowledge Mobilization Committee is chaired by myself and Justin Presseau, and we have knowledge brokers, Alex Lithopoulos and Selina Allu. Justin and Alex are based in Ottawa, and Selina and I are based in Calgary. So we have kind of two centers where we're working from, but hoping to have national reach and bring many of you who work at all the different centers that are affiliated with the ACT Consortium into the knowledge mobilization work. And the work that we do would be impossible without the support from the ACT core team, specifically Ipsita, who's our project manager for the Knowledge Mobilization Committee and does many other things for ACT. And we are also very fortunate to work closely with Alyssa, who is the communications officer for ACT. And clearly, as you all probably know, there's a very close linkage between knowledge mobilization and communications. And so we're very fortunate to work with Alyssa as well to help us work together synergistically. I'll let Justin introduce himself and Selina later as well in more detail, but for myself, I'm a clinician scientist based here at the University of Calgary. I do lots of research and policy trials. I'm the co-director of the Health Policy Trials Unit based at the O'Brien Institute in the University of Calgary. And so we do controlled trials that are not clinical in nature, but of policy or program interventions. And because of that, my work is tied to knowledge mobilization. I wouldn't describe myself as a KM expert, and that's why I'm pleased to work with Justin and Selina and Alex, who are, but the work that I do is very closely linked to the need to mobilize findings and get them to policymakers and decision makers. And so KM is near and dear to my heart, even if I have a long way to go in terms of learning, and that's why I'm glad to be part of this committee. All right, Selina, you can go to the next slide. So in terms of what are we doing as a committee, our mandate really, as part of ACT, is to help trialists who are doing wonderful, great trials across this country to help us think about how do we get our trials into action. And that'll look very different for each of us who are doing trials in our very different spheres of different clinical interests, as well as different types of intervention. So to whom we're trying to present our findings and the ways that we do that may look very, very different. And so we are here to be a resource to the entire ACT network, and we are hoping to do that through a number of different ways. And these are the activities that we have planned for this year and into next year. And so you all probably received an email inviting you to complete a knowledge mobilization survey of all ACT members that went out before the holidays or just after the holidays, and it's still circulating. I believe that it's still open for anybody who would like to complete the survey. We are always looking for more responses, and you'll have a chance to hear about the responses to the survey and what we heard from our network at the next knowledge mobilization webinar, and we'll come back to that at the end. Today, we are launching the Knowledge Mobilization Award. So you'll hear much more about that throughout the remainder of this presentation today. And then once we've launched that award, we'll then be going into a phase where we're looking to highlight knowledge mobilization case studies, or people who are doing randomized trials across this country who are using innovative knowledge mobilization strategies, or thinking about different ways to get the findings of their trials communicated to different decision makers and knowledge holders. And that will be an opportunity for you. We'll have an open call for you to come forward or to nominate some of your colleagues who may be doing innovative or interesting things that we want to highlight to help inspire others. Along with that, we talked about the webinar series, and that will be a chance for us to highlight some of these different ways that you might think about mobilizing the knowledge from your trials. And so we're hoping that by creating a community where people can come together and share what's working well for them and what they're doing that is maybe a little bit outside of the box, that we'll all improve our knowledge mobilization practice. And towards the end of this calendar year, we then will, of course, report back to ACT Central Operations Committee, as well as back to CIHR about the work that we've been able to catalyze as a Knowledge Mobilization Committee, and back to all of you as members of the ACT community, so that you can see what this particular branch of the great, the large ACT ecosystem is doing. And so we will have a report back towards the end of this year. So our time horizon is quite short. We've got 1 year to do many things, and we hope that you are all who are attending today will be active contributors and participants to the KM activities. So without further ado, I know the most exciting part about today is hearing about the award and the possibility of receiving some funding to support KM activities. I'll pass it over to Justin, and maybe he can introduce himself and then take us through the funding opportunity that we have before us.
Brilliant. Thanks, Dave. And welcome, everyone. My name is Justin Presseau, and I'm just delighted to co-chair the KM committee in ACT with Dave and supported by our amazing team. So I am the director of the Methodological and Implementation Research Program at the Ottawa Hospital Research Institute, where I'm also directing the Center for Implementation Research. And given that you hear the word implementation in my roles, I live and breathe the idea of how do we make sure that the findings that are generated in the randomized trials that people are involved in can make a difference in routine practice and policy. And so I think about this all the time, and I'm really excited to support all of you in thinking that through, and how can we go from incredible trials that people are conducting and publishing and presenting on, and how do we move them even further on into practice and policy. And with that in mind, we are so excited to launch this funding opportunity within ACT, which is launching, I think, on Monday specifically. But we're really designing this to try to support innovative knowledge mobilization strategies to try to maximize the impact of RCT findings, again, on policy and practice. We have a funding envelope of $40K in total, and we're hoping and we're funding a maximum of $10,000 for any given award. The deadline for submission is March 24th at noon Eastern, and we're hoping that gives folks enough time, considering our other deadlines, including CIHR project grants, so about a month and a half. So, but why might you consider applying for this award? So clearly super important to be disseminating your trial findings for those of you conducting trials in high impact journals, and publishing to your and presenting to your peers at academic and medical conferences. For sure, that's important, but that is not what this funding is designed to do. We're hoping that you can leverage this funding opportunity to go beyond that, to try to think about innovative ways of disseminating the findings of a completed randomized trial to different audiences, to broader audiences, to try to create a broader impacts with your work alongside the traditional ways that you might be disseminating findings. So we're hoping that you might explore those different innovative ways, and Selina is going to talk us through some of those to help get you thinking about some of those opportunities, and then ultimately as a way to showcase your work within ACT in ways that help you to connect with other researchers and interest holders that you might not otherwise do by thinking through how your findings, how your trial could be disseminated differently. Next slide. So to give you a sense of the eligibility criteria for this particular opportunity, for this one in particular, we're focusing on RCTs only. That must be completed or planned for completion by the end of this summer, by August 31st, 2025. that it has to involve a PI that's a Canadian researcher and a member of ACT, that we're asking for proposals to have the endorsement of one of the 34 ACT networks. We're not asking for a letter, but rather that you get an endorsement from one of the networks. That the budget be including line items that are otherwise CIHR eligible, and that you have institutional confirmation of that. And that if you were to be the successful awardee of this, that you acknowledge ACT partnership in any subsequent presentations and publications. Next slide. So to give you a sense of what we're hoping to receive from the applications, in one PDF, maximum 5 pages in English or 6 en français, that the first page be a summary of the trial, the title, confirming ACT eligibility, its details, and where it's at in terms of completion. And then the meat of the application really being the written 2-pager, where we hope to see a knowledge mobilization gap that's being addressed, the potential to impact policy or practice, an engagement plan that includes people with lived and living experience and EDIA considerations, a description of your expertise on the team, the roles, and the collaborative approach that you intend to take, and a description of the timeline and the feasibility of completing the KM portion of this by December 2025, or at least spending the funds by then. A fourth page focused on justifying the budget, again, confirming CIHR eligibility. And then if you want an extra page for references, figures, or tables that you don't have to include in that 2-pager section. Next slide. So give you a sense of how we will then adjudicate applications. So we're primarily focusing on in terms of review criteria on the proposal, 85% of that, and then 15% will be considered in terms of budget appropriateness. Our review panel consists of trialists, of knowledge mobilization experts, and representatives from patients and communities, who will be scoring the applications out of 100, where our threshold for funding being at least 60. And that in cases where there are tied scores, we will consider in-kind or match funds as having an advantage. So do flag those in your budget line items if that is relevant to you. Next slide. In terms of timelines, as I say, we'll launch officially on the 10th, which I think is Monday, with a deadline of 24th of March at noon Eastern. And then we hope to announce awardees early in the spring on the 5th of May, with the idea that the funded knowledge mobilization activities could be completed by 12th of December. So if you're interested in applying, these are the steps. You would submit your combined PDF on the online portal, which will provide links to in the launch call and email. That you make sure that you get endorsement from one of the ACT networks, and of course follow the guidelines that are consistent with what you might expect from CIHR application, for example. And then once you submit, if you don't receive acknowledgement within 24 hours, do reach out just to make sure and to double check if anything's gone awry. So that's an overview of the funding opportunity, which we're so excited to be supporting. And I'm going to hand it over to Selina, who's going to walk us through a sort of a KM 101 and give you some ideas of what you could consider in going forward. Over to you, Selina.
Thanks, Justin. Hello, everybody. My name is Selina, and I am a knowledge translation broker and an implementation support practitioner. I kind of have two dual roles. I support CanSolve CKD, which is a large CIHR chronic disease spore network, as well as the nephrology research group here at the University of Calgary. So I just want to start off by acknowledging with gratitude and appreciation that the land on which I walk and live are the traditional territories of the people of Treaty 7 in southern Alberta, and the city of Calgary, where I live, is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta, Districts 5 and 6. So thank you again. As researchers, we want to do research that has value and impact. So what knowledge mobilization really is, it's a process of moving that evidence into practice to maximize impact. It consists of all the activities and the products to make that research useful to the people who need to use that research to affect change. So it would include activities such as creating awareness about your trial results, disseminating those findings, and also supporting or enabling the use of those research. For clinical trials to have an impact, results need to be shared in usable formats for a range of audiences. And this will require you to tailor your message so that it meets the needs and the preferences of your audience. So right away, you want to ask yourself these sort of 5 big questions. What do you want to share? Whom do you want to share those results with? How will you share that message, or in what format? Does it meet the needs and preferences of your audience? And what do you want them to do with that information? A quick Google search will suggest hundreds of innovative ways and products that you could come up with to share your trial results. And before we dive into the actual innovative options, I want to pause for a few minutes to spend some time really highlighting what do we mean when we say who your audience is, right? So who are these people you want to share your results with? For simplicity, one thing that we use and that I've used when I've been working with a couple of teams is to think about target audiences in sort of these 5 buckets. They're either healthcare practitioners, they're patients and their family members or their caregivers, they could be other researchers, decision makers, and the public. Now, within each of these categories, we can be even more specific. So perhaps what I want to do is I want to target healthcare practitioners, but specifically, I want my research findings or my clinical trial results to reach a family doctor who lives in a rural province or in a rural city in Manitoba, for example. I also want my research findings to reach a patient with a chronic disease, and this patient perhaps also lives in a remote region. So the questions I'm asking here are like, where are they going for that information and how do they like to receive that information? As we start to understand who our target audience is, we can appreciate why conventional methods such as publications or conferences may not be the most effective knowledge mobilization strategies. So what I'm going to do over the next 5 or 10 minutes is to show you 2 approaches that you could use when you want to create a tailored knowledge mobilization product or a strategy to share your clinical trial results. The first option is to identify your target audience first, and then to develop your knowledge mobilization strategy or product. I think this is an approach most of us are quite familiar with. So in this instance, you would deeply think about who you want to share your results with. And for example, it could be prescribing pharmacists in a kidney clinic. And then you go about choosing your most effective strategy and product. In the second option, you identify the goal of your message first, and then you develop your knowledge mobilization strategy and product. So basically, at this point, what I mean by what is the goal of your message is you want to ask yourself, do you want to inform your audience? Do you want to engage with your audience? Or do you want them to act on the information that you're sharing with them? So in option 1, you know your audience, okay? So now let's find the best knowledge mobilization product or strategy that you can use to share your results with. This is probably one of my go-to resources. And the reason I like this resource is because it provides a really quick summary of the different knowledge mobilization products and activities for each of those 5 audience buckets that I spoke of earlier. The table that you see on the right that looks a little bit like a heat map highlights the effectiveness of each of those knowledge mobilization strategies by your target audience. So for example, if you wanted to share your results with a decision maker, creating a tailored summary in the form of a briefing note will be far more effective than just passively sharing your results at a meeting. So let's look at some of these products in a little more detail. Healthcare practitioners in this instance would include people such as doctors, nurses, pharmacists, other allied healthcare professionals, right? So a couple of things that you could do is you could create, or you could support the modification of a clinical decision support tool so that your trial findings can contribute to the evidence that's already out there. So this could be one option for a knowledge mobilization strategy. Another thing you could do if you want to target healthcare practitioners is you could educate them by developing an interactive CME module, for example, where they could learn to simulate trial results to patient scenarios. Or you could just create something like a very visual summary, like an infographic that illustrates how your results can reduce hospitalization rates, for example. There are many products that you can create for patients, right? And I think most of us are familiar with plain language summaries. And so you could create a plain language summary to explain, for example, how a new drug or medication can improve patient quality of life. A shared decision aid can help patients weigh the pros and the cons of new treatments. So your trial can contribute to improving or updating an existing decision aid, or suggest if a new decision aid needs to be developed. Either way, it is a really good idea if you can include patient testimonials in these products to show how your trial has impacted patients. Remember, personal stories are the things that really help people understand the benefits of your trial. You can also combine some of these strategies, and I've just highlighted this one example of an interactive infographic that we developed several years ago. And this infographic, as you'll see, has links to multiple forms of information that can help a patient or their family members navigate what dialysis options are available to them. So this is just one example. In this slide, I've highlighted 4 creative options for getting your message to decision makers, right? And again, we're going to share a copy of these slides, so don't feel like you have to frantically write down these points. But, you know, when I speak about decision makers, I'm thinking about people like policymakers, healthcare leadership, healthcare managers, etc. You know, the folks that really can support the uptake of some of the results or the interventions that are being developed from your clinical trials. Either way, some of the things you want to think about if you want to reach this particular target audience would be things around how your message could be talking about economic savings, right? So for example, if a new treatment was implemented, what are the cost savings there? You could create a projection graph, for example. You could also demonstrate how investing in a new device, for example, reduces healthcare expenditures in, using strategies such as like a scientific roadshow or a TED-style talk. When communicating your trial findings with other researchers, it is perfectly acceptable to share your results with them through publications and presentations. But what if you could host a collaborative workshop with patients, with funding partners, and other researchers to brainstorm ideas on scaling outcomes? Or what if you could implement, or you could create an implementation playbook? And by that, I mean it's like a how-to manual to adopt and operationalize your trial findings. Like, wouldn't those be sort of innovative and kind of novel ways of presenting your results? So these are just a few options that you could think about. And then finally, if you want to share your results with the general public, you could do many things, right? And these are probably strategies that most of us are familiar with. You could do things like host a community forum to discuss how your results can be applied in practice. You could run a social media campaign if you have the time or the resources. You can use existing platforms like Instagram to share bite-sized updates. You can also think about sharing information via podcasts and videos, which are, very popular these days. Both options present some really creative ways to showcase real stories that can help people connect to the work that you do, right? You can share actual stories in these videos and podcasts. Today, with everyone having a smartphone, I think it's very cost effective to create a video if you wanted to. The second option that I'm going to talk about is thinking about how you can craft a tailored knowledge mobilization product or a strategy by identifying your goal first and then developing your product. So it's kind of a different way of looking at it. And if you want to consider this option, the question I'm asking here is, why do I want to share my results and what formats can I use? So there are basically sort of three reasons or three goals for sharing your information. If your goal is to raise awareness about your results, and by that I mean you're sort of pushing information out there, your options could include strategies that could be paper-based, person-based, technology-based, or arts-based. Now, the reason I like this approach is because I can very quickly see what knowledge mobilization options are available to me. So, for example, if I have a limited budget and I only have 1 month to come up with a knowledge mobilization strategy or a product, I'm not even going to look at those technology-based options, right? Such as trying to create an app or developing professional videos. I might want to focus my energies on some of those other approaches. So I might choose to combine a paper-based option and a low-cost technology-based option, such as creating an infographic with a QR code that links to an existing website, as opposed to creating a website from scratch, right? So very similar to that infographic that I showed you earlier. Now, if your goal is to share information because you're seeking feedback from others or you want to engage with them, then here are some options for you. And by that, I'm really referring to some form of a dialogue or a two-way dialogue. So it's not just simply pushing information out there. So some of the things that you could do, you could obviously send out a survey or host a focus group session to get some feedback and engagement with your target audience. You could share your trial results at an open house or using a World Cafe method, for example, or you could host events for deliberate dialogue. Either way, I think you can see that there are a lot of options that are available to you. The technology-based options are actually really interesting because they do provide some novel ways of engaging with the target audience. And then finally, if your knowledge mobilization strategy is to change individual behavior or to influence policy, then these are some options that you could consider, right? So, at an individual level, when we're looking at clinicians, we think about things like audit and feedback, right? You could create an advisory committee or an implementation guide. You could co-design with your end users things such as electronic alerts or reminders that could be embedded in EMRs, for example, right? So I hope you're able to see that there are a lot of options out there. A lot of what you choose to use will depend on answering many questions. But I hope that I've convinced you that effective knowledge mobilization is multi-pronged, right? It involves strategic orchestration of multiple outputs and strategies and activities to achieve your goals. The one final word that I'd like to share with you, and this is a great tip. We've used this in our own context and when I'm consulting with different groups. If the institution or the organization you are working with has a communications team, my advice to you is get to know them. They're a great resource and they can advise you on things such as what are the best channels to use to communicate your message. They can tell you if there are any media opportunities that you can leverage. They're a great resource to help review some of your outputs for things such as style and tone of your messaging. And they can also tell you what might be a best time to launch your knowledge mobilization activities if you want maximum impact. You can also ask them questions such as like, does our organization have any plans for national awareness days, right? So March is Kidney Awareness Month, right? Can we piggyback some of our messaging around these national events for impact? You can also ask them what channels are available to you to use, right? Many of these could be available free of charge. And they can also have some resources in-house that you could also leverage, like a graphic designer. So I hope that helps, and I'm now going to hand it over to Dave.
Thank you, Selina. That was wonderful. Thank you so much for the overview. And I think now we're just at the point where we're open for questions. Your questions may pertain to the funding opportunity, or they may be more generic about knowledge mobilization practices or products that you may be considering and wanting some feedback or ideas with. So more than happy to take questions and open the floor for anybody who would like to ask myself or Justin or Selina or Alex or Ipsita any questions you may have. I don't see any in the chat yet, Ipsita, but you can either type them in the chat or unmute. I think there's a way to unmute and ask questions.
Sorry, I'm not sure if I should raise my hand or not. I'm trying to find the raise hand.
That's fine. Go ahead, Catherine. Yeah, please go ahead.
Apologize that. Thank you for this presentation. I think it's very informative, and I will say I've worked in knowledge mobilization a long time, and I never have seen a shout out of the communications group department and, recommending to leverage them as support. I think it's often, whose role is what when you're working with the communications group. So I really do appreciate that shout out. Thank you. I'm curious around, in the clinical trial space specifically, when you're looking at those like person-based implementation outcomes and the need to really engage in a co-design knowledge mobilization approach, how, if anyone has experience on the panel or really in the audience, I'm happy to hear from them. How can researchers navigate the need to comply with regulatory policy, comply with regulations, which can be very strict for clinical trials, while also bringing in and authentically reflecting the feedback of community members in line with the co-design approach? Wondering if anyone has experience with that.
Yeah, really great question, Catherine. I mean, I can speak from my own experience that I think it's possible if the co-design is happening very early on, right? That if the community group or the people that you're designing the intervention with are involved from the very outset and helping you come up with the intervention before it's even billed as a clinical trial, or before you've applied for funding, before you've applied for ethics, there's opportunities to make sure the community's voice is represented in the interventions that we design. I think sometimes the pitfall that I see is that people want to involve community once they've already decided what their intervention is going to be. We're going to do this program and we want patient engagement, and we want community input. And sometimes it doesn't match necessarily with what the community wants. And I think that is one area where there can create tension, is if the engagement is not done early enough. And you're kind of too far down, as you said, kind of once you position this as a clinical trial, you're in a pipeline, and there's a very clear pipeline of regulations and ethics and all these things that need to be followed. And at that point, it's hard to work in the voices of external stakeholders. So from my perspective, I think early involvement before you even conceive of what the clinical trial is, sometimes even the trial design might look different, right? The community may not. So I've had some experience where we thought we had a great idea and the community said, no, we would not support individual level randomization. It's not ethical in our view. And we had to completely revamp the trial design and say, well, how do we work with these communities and meet the need that exists, but in a way that's acceptable to the community? And if we'd done that later on, it would have been too late to change our mind. So I think that's what I'd have to say. I don't know, Justin, Selina, Alex, if you have anything to add.
I would definitely agree with that. Maybe the only thing I would add is thinking more broadly around the interest holders here, that if you have access to and can form relationships with regulators or representatives of different at that policy or regulation level, and involving them alongside community and patient partnerships in that co-development phase, and they may have to recuse themselves from certain conversations, but having that conversation early and part of the overall kind of integrated KM approach can extend beyond including not only the patient and people with lived experience, but also potentially system actors as well.
And sorry, I would just very quickly like to add, that was a really good question, Catherine. I think Dave and Justin have answered I hope they've answered your question. From an implementation lens, so again, thinking about equitable implementation, I think it is so important to consider exactly what Justin and Dave have suggested, especially in this landscape where we need to look at our work through an EDIA lens, right? And very often things we design don't always reach everybody, right? So we also need to be thinking about that equitable implementation phase. And so asking those questions about how you involve some of these key end users and, even if it's regulating bodies, like how do we involve them from the very beginning so that we can ensure that what we are designing and what knowledge we are producing can also be equitably implemented, I think is really important.
That is indeed very important. I appreciate that addition to the answer. Thank you very much, Selina. And thank you, everybody.
Thanks, Catherine. Great question. Okay, I'm just seeing in the chat box, we have a question. Maddie is asking who the onus should be on for knowledge mobilization. And she makes the observation that it seems that some feel that KM is beyond their scope. And I think that's a really good point. And I do think that traditionally, I think especially in the trial space, clinical trialists kind of see their role as designing a very rigorous randomized trial, making sure that we have all the regulatory approval, the ethics, and conduct the trial to the best of our ability. And then we present the science, right? I think a lot of times us trialists, we put ourselves in the box of, I'm a scientist and I do the science and somebody else can sort out all that other stuff. But I do think that there's increasing awareness that science for science's sake is quite limited. And a lot of the science that we do, certainly if we're working in the space of publicly funded research and science, we're taking taxpayer dollars to do the trials that we do. And there's an onus on us to do more than just publish a paper presented at a conference and to actually see benefit ultimately arrive back in Canadians' hands. And I think that there is the onus for doing knowledge mobilization should be on each of us as investigators. And I think you're totally right that many investigators don't necessarily have the skill set to do this. And that's why, I've certainly put myself in that category, but being able to work with, skilled people who know how to do this and bringing in some of the expertise from our colleagues in communications offices and knowledge brokers like Selina, having them help and inform us on what we can do. So I think you're right. I think it's easy for us to kind of pass the buck on this, but I think it's becoming more and more incumbent that we see KM as part of science. It's part of the research. It's really the ultimate objective of the research. And so I think the days of passing the buck on that are hopefully behind us, but pass it on to my colleagues.
Yeah, if I could add to that, Dave, exactly what you were saying about the KM being part of the science, I think it's also important to not think of KM as a separate activity that happens and that it's really part of the knowledge creation, generation, sharing, making its way back to the patient populations, to the healthcare community, and then those communities generating those questions, those research questions, and that really guiding the research. So it's really part of a cycle as well, is the other way to think about it, as not a separate part of research, but a very integrated and intentional part of the whole research cycle. So I think it's important for research teams to conceptualize it that way. And even when they're building their research teams, to have the balance of interdisciplinarity and, different voices and different skills and different perspectives so that it doesn't actually feel difficult or it doesn't feel like it should land on any one person, but really that we're all learning together as we're collaborating in an interdisciplinary way.
One thing I might add is if not you, if not us, then who, I guess is the question. And I think the opportunity here and the exciting opportunity for a network like ACT to fully engage in KM and to think about KM is that whenever folks have looked at whether or not the trial evidence is filtering through into routine practice, it's such a consistent finding to say that a substantial amount of even high quality published in the best journals trials don't end up filtering through to practice because there's just so much volume is one thing. So many trials, so many great trials are being published. And it's not necessarily the case that just publishing the trial leads to that awareness and or change in practice that Selina's talking about. And so, and there isn't necessarily a group of people that's always kind of listening and waiting for things to be published. There are some of that in some areas, but not in every area. So I think having a more consistent integrated pipeline that, like Sita's talking about, is really crucial, so that that can be, translation can be accelerated, and even possible in some ways.
Excellent. Justin, maybe I'll pass the follow-up question here from Catherine to you on that same note. Catherine is asking that from a workforce development perspective, what are the core knowledge mobilization competencies that institutions should look for in their employees going forward in order to build up this workforce that can do this work? I don't know if you have any thoughts on that. Working at your institution, I'm sure that's something you think about all the time.
Yeah, it's such a good question. And it's a broad question. So I think that there are knowledge mobilization, implementation science, KT competencies that are a bit more generic. And then there's, I think, a novel aspect of the trial focused element of this that is really what we're leaning into within ACT. And I think that they're similar, but they're more specific in the trial space. And I think there's potentially an opportunity there for from a workforce development perspective in institutions that have trial units to think about how can people that understand the nuts and bolts of conducting high quality clinical trials, randomized trials, also be upskilled in the knowledge mobilization space. So it's not two different roles, but rather a more an integrated role potentially, or someone who really understands how the trials work and also be a knowledge mobilization expert. I think that would create a really unique skill set to be able to really further develop the knowledge mobilization opportunities. But core KM competencies, I would probably I'm not sure you could distill it down to top 3 to 5. I think that there are, to Selina's slides, there are aspects of knowledge mobilization that are dissemination focused and audience segmentation focused, that understanding how do you reach the right people so that they can be aware, and developing the competencies and ways of accessing and connecting with people across different modalities is one whole set of competencies that also includes communications, and could involve, expertise in, again, different modalities, whether it's online or video or audio or in person, which is related to but separate from the kinds of things that Selina was talking about in terms of changing policies and changing practice. And so on the policy side, even the development of effective policy briefs is a competency and skill set in and of itself that could be fostered, and relationships management and formation of that person with that skill set with decision makers and policymakers is a whole other kind of piece. And then the change in practice, implementation, de-implementation side of things, where actual change in what clinicians or health systems are doing is also its own kind of set of competency. So in my mind, it's a lot for one person to cover, and why in my mind, it's as important for institutions to be investing in their knowledge mobilization infrastructure that includes KT, KM, implementation science, to be able to not just put the onus on only one person, but rather a team of people that can support their trial infrastructure. So a long-winded answer to say probably bigger than the top 3.
Excellent. Thanks, Justin. And I mean, I agree. I've had the opportunity to be involved with a few hiring committees lately, mostly hiring at the faculty level for new investigators at our institution. And I think one thing that I've seen being quite important is, we're not just looking for people who can do the science really well, people that are trained in the methodological rigor, but we're also looking for people that are interested and willing and able to go out and make partnerships and have that skill set as well. And so, some of this is, we might call soft skills, as opposed to kind of the hard methodological science skills, but we want people who are willing to work with communities, willing to work with decision makers, willing to work with different types of funders, and willing to kind of question their science and question the way we do things. And I think sometimes scientists are in a dogmatic mindset that we must do things a certain way. And I think if we're looking for knowledge mobilization minded practitioners, we need people who are willing to be a little bit more flexible and willing to take their science in a way that's best suited to serve their communities that they're looking to help. So I hope that answers the question. And I think, there's certainly some some of those types of things. David kind of summarized, I think, some of the answers there, ability to communicate and knowledge synthesis and engagement and networking. I think those are, yeah, a very good encapsulation of what we were just mentioning. That's great. There's another question here from Phil in the question box that says, what can a site do when they host sponsored clinical trials versus investigator-initiated clinical trials? And with the observation that it often seems that the sponsor is responsible for KM, but maybe the sites want to be more involved with mobilizing the knowledge and helping their participants and patients benefit from the trials that are conducted at their sites. So instead of me taking the first crack at this, maybe I'll open the floor and see if anybody else wants to kind of think about that in terms of sponsored versus investigator initiated. I don't know, Justin, if you want to take the first stab at that.
I mean, it feels like at the very least having the conversation with the sponsor early in terms of those roles and responsibilities to see whether they are open to or taking responsibility for this. Kind of goes back to the earlier point around where's the onus, and just at least being clear on roles and what might be possible, and thinking through what amongst the options might be appropriate from a sponsor relative to an investigator initiated one. And that probably will vary depending on the nature of what's being evaluated and the sponsor, I suspect, but feels as appropriate to be thinking about it, but might be approached slightly differently in the communication from the start with the sponsor. Feels relevant. Not sure how helpful that is, but
yeah, exactly. It's kind of what I was thinking as well, is that, I think a lot of times as Selina just presented, when we talk knowledge mobilization, it's important to think about who is our intended audience. And I think most of the time in a commercially sponsored trial, the intended audience is the regulator, whether that's Health Canada or, CDA, the Canadian Drug Agency, somebody who's going to list the product and recommend the product. I think that's certainly the corporate entity's intent usually. That's why they're doing the trial in the first place. But I think for the host sites, they might have a different intention. They probably aren't going to benefit commercially from the sales of these products, but they're in it because they want their patients to benefit. And so thinking about if there's a trial that's really successful and achieves the trial outcomes that we want, well, we know the sponsor is going to go advocate for its own commercial self-interest, but I think as host site sponsors and investigators, I think we can also advocate to make sure that those products are made available to our patients as quickly and as expeditiously as possible. And some of that has to do with advocating to our own provincial formularies for a product that is newly listed on CDA's recommendations, to make sure that we're kind of saying we were part of this trial. And there's certainly some advocacy and policy knowledge mobilization that I think we can undertake in that realm. So. Coming to David's question here, it's more specific to the funding call. And David is wondering how the funding opportunity encourages the integration of theories, models, and frameworks in the evaluation of the trial, of the proposals that we're going to be reviewing. So Justin, do you want to take that one?
I mean, my sense is we aren't explicitly calling for them, but in the adjudication process, what those approaches will provide is structure and coherence and drawing from background. So could be helpful to consider, but we haven't specifically listed them as sort of essential components. But if that's your jam, I think that would probably help thinking through the two-pager.
Excellent. I think there's a question here in the panel that from Aaron that says that the talk today was geared largely toward researchers, which is a fair point. And it seems that Aaron is a patient partner working with research teams, wondering where do patients fit in terms of knowledge mobilization, and what advice could we as a panel give to a patient who may feel that the knowledge mobilization, I presume, of the trial or of the team they're working with is insufficient. So that's a really, really interesting perspective. I think, Aaron, there's a close linkage between patient engagement and patient partnership and knowledge mobilization. Not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. It depends on the trial and who we're trying to mobilize the knowledge for. And as we've kind of discussed already, some trials are really geared towards agencies or funders or other people, but there's certainly a number of trials that do have a direct necessity to mobilize the knowledge to patients. I think a lot of times as patients, we are consumers of the healthcare system, and the things that we ask our doctors for and demand carry a lot of weight. And so I think that there is a need for us to mobilize our findings to patients so that they can understand. I think we all know that scientists speak a certain language, and sometimes we don't always present the knowledge from the trials that we generate in a way that's digestible by patients who don't have PhDs. And so I think demanding that the trialists do a better job conveying the results of their trials for lay audiences is really important. And I guess in terms of advice, if for our patient partners who may feel the knowledge mobilization is insufficient, really good question. And I think it would really come down to what type of relationship you have with the trial team and with the investigators at the institution, and hopefully in a model of true patient partnership as opposed to kind of patient consultation, they would be looking for your feedback and your input. And that's certainly one of the things that I think you heard Selina mention, is that good knowledge mobilization considers all of the perspectives, and you as a patient certainly have a different perspective than the investigators likely do. And so hopefully they'd be open to you coming and saying, hey, listen, I think we need to message this differently, or I think we're missing the mark in terms of who needs to hear about this trial. And I think that's, if that's the case, that's a mark of positive patient partnership, where you're truly an equal with the investigators. But I know that's not often the case, where there's a little bit more tokenistic engagement of patients, and it may be harder to have your voice heard. So I think it really comes down to that. And I think as a community, we're hoping to kind of drive more of those authentic and integrated teams that have not just one set of knowledge and expertise, but really bring in the lived experience as well.
And I think
Justin, Selina, anything that? Yeah, go ahead.
Just to add to that, I think that's partly the ethos of this funding opportunity as well, that we are weighting heavily the engagement plan that include people with lived and living experience as part of our as just part of the proposal for the knowledge mobilization activities. And so thinking about this particular opportunity as a way that could empower patients to be involved in adding recommending new opportunities, new and innovative opportunities to trial teams that they might see. But also, this isn't the only type of award like this. There are sport impact awards or other types of ways to think about not only working from the start, but throughout, and finding pockets of funding opportunities that are dedicated specifically to these types of engagement and mobilization activities. That I think really having a patient voice is essential from the start and throughout in those applications and delivery of plans.
I think the last question here in the box, and probably the last one we have time to take, is D. Cameron has mentioned that trying to carve out achievable recommendations that address ACT's goals specifically, like a toolkit to help trialists engage with decision makers to undertake knowledge mobilization. And I think that's a really good point. It's something we've talked about in our committee, and I think we kind of settled on the notion that because ACT is such a heterogeneous community of people doing such different trials of different interventions for different people, for different audiences, it's kind of hard to provide, a blanket toolkit. But I think and that's part of what we wanted to do with the knowledge mobilization case studies that I mentioned at the beginning, where we're going to highlight different types of successful KM that people have done for different audiences. We're doing an asset mapping kind of exercise as well, which kind of started with the survey, where we're trying to get a sense of who in Canada is doing KM in a unique and different way, to kind of highlight some of these so that we can all be inspired to think about our KM in a different way and learn from each other. So I think that's maybe our contribution there. But Justin, do you have anything to add there? I think it's a great suggestion, but I think we talked about that and kind of struggled with the sheer differences between us as a community.
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to add. I think I agree very much with within the context of the next year of work that we have, that we're trying to chip away at that exact challenge. And but it's such a helpful suggestion that I think we should take back to our committee and think about, whatever future ACT looks like, or generally how do we support trials across Canada going forward, that maybe we'll work towards something a bit more formalized that builds off of what we're trying to accomplish in this first year of our work.
Wonderful. Thanks, Justin. Selina, do you want to go to the next slide? And maybe I'll pass it over to Ipsita to kind of take us through the next steps in the next webinar.
Sure, great. Well, thanks to all of our speakers today for launching this KM webinar series. Really happy that so many people could join us today. So on Monday, our website will be live with call for proposals page that will have all of the details about this funding opportunity. And as Justin said, the closing for that, so all applications will be due on March 24th. So please get in touch with us as you're going through the application process. If you have any questions, our team would be happy to field those questions and support you with your application, or sort of any questions that you have about what should or shouldn't be included, etc. Thank you so much for joining us.